March 16. Fed Chairman Jay Powell said a recession is unlikely though. The reality is that the Fed has raised rates and cut off lifeline support for the economy.
A few months later, on June 22, Powell said a recession was a possibility, but not likely. I wonder what has changed. GDP growth slowed for Q2, and real growth slowed to an annualized rate of 0.6% in the second quarter of 2022, after a 1.6% decline in the first quarter. Which means, technically, we're in a recession. But Jay Powell said he doesn't think the US is in a recession right now.
He seems to have his own interpretation of recession.
This is probably what happens when you fail at your job. However, a month later, on August 30th, he said that some pawn was on the horizon. I wonder what that means. The economy is in decline, the stock market has crashed, and companies are going bankrupt. But Jay Powell continues to avoid the word recession. He's willing to call it what you want, but no, a recession. May I tell you what some pain means? That means putting people out of work, closing small businesses because of the cost. Money increases because the interest rate increases. Companies cannot borrow more to sustain the growth they had in the last 2 years. Some people find it hard to understand that money will not solve all your problems. If a business is unprofitable, it can survive if you keep giving it cash. But it doesn't matter how long you keep feeding it. If it's not going to be profitable, it's going to fall apart financially. The support dries. Have you ever been to the subway? Generally, a subway store employs 3 to 4 people. If we double the number of workers there, they will not produce twice as many. Of the subways, their productivity will likely decrease because they will disturb each other. The space is small enough for 8 people to work productively.
This is known as the law of diminishing returns, when an additional input will cause a negative
output, but at the end of the day, you have to pay them all, at least minimum wage.
This is not a problem when you have access to free money, but when it is free money not available, you start getting into trouble. You have to reduce your workforce and try to be as efficient as possible with only 3 employees at every subway store. That's why we have the news that Bed Bath & Living are cutting more than 20% their shops. PayPal began laying off employees in May. Coinbase will lay off 18% of its workforce. Tesla has already begun laying off 10% of its workforce, former employees have confirmed on LinkedIn that they have been fired. While the Fed is trying to reassure us that everything is fine and we shouldn't worry, the reality is far from that, especially if you ask Ray Dalio who he believes America is on the brink of disaster. Why the United States debt crisis will lead the country to a crisis the world has never seen. First, why it would not only destroy the markets, but could destroy the US economy.
How much does the Fed raise rates to finally bring down inflation? And how to prepare for the worst disaster in American history.
We will answer all these questions and more. But before we do that, give this video a thumbs up.
And let's dive in. The primary function of the Federal Reserve is to protect the value of the dollar, to maintain people's confidence in the dollar, to make sure that your dollars will not be worthless tomorrow. So, when inflation is almost touching double digits, it is clear that the Fed is failing
on his most important work. But it's not always the Fed's fault. The federal government is also responsible because the president literally appoints
the chairman of the Fed, who is the most important decision maker in the Fed. Second, sometimes the government spends more, such as by distributing or forgiving stimulus checks. Student loans. There is no such thing as free money.
If you borrow money, you have to pay it back, plus interest. That's how capitalism is.
Works the moment you abuse this printing press and continue printing to pay for everything.
Your currency will depreciate rapidly. Hypothetically, imagine that there are 10 goods and $10 in the entire economy.
In this hypothetical example, each good would cost $1.
If we put an extra $10 into the economy, there will now be $20.
But still there are 10 goods in the economy that will double the price of each.
Supply and demand. Of course, this is just a theoretical example, but you get the point.
When you pour trillions of dollars into the economy, that's what you get, whether you
like it or not. And instead of trying to solve the problem by restricting the money supply, the Fed is
saying that inflation is caused by energy shortages or supply chain problems.
Yes, of course, These are the factors that are contributing to inflation, but still
doesn't exclude the fact that there are too many dollars in the economy.
in the 1970s, when the inflation rate reached 11%.
Guess what Arthur Burns said? Who was the chairman of the Fed at that time? He blamed shortages or energy and food. Later, though, he raised overnight rates to over 12% by mid-1974. This immediately cut inflation in half, which was good news. But this naturally created a recession since suddenly, there was significantly less money flowing into the economy, causing the unemployment rate to rise from 5% to nearly 9%. Instead of holding rates up longer, Burns panicked and cut rates.
Brought back inflation. Inflation remained high until Paul Volcker was appointed chairman of the Fed. 1979. He raised rates to 19% and kept them high for a few years.
He was unpopular. People hated him, but he left office with inflation around 3%.
And it seems as if the exact same scenario is repeating itself now.
Instead of raising rates last year, the Fed denied any sign of inflation. Now it's not growing them high enough and blaming global energy prices. The economy is going into recession, and they are changing the definition of recession. Come on guys. Raising rates will hurt, but you know what hurts more? Watching the value of your savings disappear. According to Ray Dalio, this is what happens when empires reach their peak. The whole empire runs on debt. However, one's debt is another's financial asset. Literally, a passive income asset. When the United States debt rises, so does someone else on the other side of the world.
That debt gets rich. As this debt grows over time, it becomes more difficult to maintain. It's like when you go into debt. When you get a mortgage, you only have to pay $1,500 per month. No burden. But then you get a car loan, credit card loan, travel loan, your renovation loan. Home, but your income is not growing at that pace. So, at some point, you either have to cut back on your spending or go bankrupt.
The problem is that when the source of wealth is printing money, no one pays. More focus on where the wealth is coming from. Everyone got their pay, but no one's money was taken, so it's political.
Easy. So you've heard the "we need to spend money on thizzes" and "we need to do" debates. Spend money on it, but not much talk about where the money comes from. Everyone was worried about the stimulus check, but no one was worried, asking where. Where is the money coming from? And now America is indirectly leading the war against Russia by defending Ukraine.
Where is the money coming from? Student loan forgiveness. Where is the money coming from? The list goes on and on. And then we think why we have so much inflation. You cannot cheat the basic laws of supply and demand.
I know that rising rates will reduce profits, but higher inflation will squeeze consumers.
As well as purchasing power, consumers are losing out both ways. The only difference is that savers won't suffer in the long run, like things
should be. Sooner or later, the Fed will have to admit that, and that will raise rates that much higher. And long enough that it would create a kind of stagnation that some people would move forward with. At least years. We've already talked about how to protect yourself during inflation, but here are a few tips from Ray Dalio. Create as diverse a portfolio as possible. Range from inflation-indexed bonds, which Dalio recommends above regular bonds, to physical assets such as to sleep. Find out how many weeks you can survive financially if you lose your job. It always pays to figure out whatever the worst-case scenario is and cover yourself. To her, when there's a stalemate, there's not much you can do, so it's always better to prepare in advance. Thanks for watching and see you next time.